The moment my brother raised his glass at his own wedding and called me our eternal waitress in front of hundreds of guests, something inside me shattered. I'm Claire Donovan, 42 years old, and that single toast carried the weight of 15 years of mockery, silence, and quiet humiliation. My family had always painted me as the failure, the sister who never made it, the daughter who wasted her life. They believed it so completely. They repeated it until it became gospel at every reunion, every holiday, every funeral. But as I stood there, forced into a smile, while my parents chuckled along and the guests laughed politely, I swore it would be the last time anyone mistook who I really was. The ballroom glittered with gold light from chandeliers that swung slightly above the dance floor. Crystal glasses chimed in steady rhythm as servers moved between the tables. At the center of it all stood Michael, my younger brother, handsome in his tailored tuxedo, holding court as if the entire evening belonged to him. His bride beamed at his side, her veil catching the light like spun glass. When Michael raised his champagne glass, I already knew what was coming. He smiled. The kind of smile that looked charming to strangers, but always carried an edge I'd known since childhood. "This is my sister, Claire," he said, his voice ringing easily over the microphone. "We all know her, we all love her, but let's be honest, she's our eternal waitress. 20 years and she's never switched lanes, serving one person after another, never moving on." The laugh that followed wasn't full or warm. It was fractured, uneasy, like glass cracking under pressure. A few guests chuckled politely, others shifted in their chairs, glancing sideways to see how I would react. From the head table, my mother's nervous laugh rose above the din, sharp and brittle. Margaret always knew how to play along, to smooth the edges of Michael's cruelty, as if her endorsement could make his words less cutting. I sat perfectly still, the stem of my glass locked between my fingers. On the surface, I managed a calm smile, the kind of smile that cost more strength than most people will ever know. Inside, however, a single sentence pulsed like a vow. The truth is coming, and this time, no one will be able to stop it. Then, across the room, my eyes caught a figure I hadn't expected. Captain Daniel Alvarez, his white dress uniform standing out like a beacon. He wasn't just a guest. He was a man who knew me not by false labels, but by the weight of classified missions and midnight orders. He had served beside me. He had seen what my family never would. For a heartbeat, I forgot the sting of Michael's words. The air seemed to tighten with possibility. If fate ever had a sense of irony, it was here, in this ballroom, on this night. And as I exhaled slowly, my chest steady, I realized destiny had just stepped into the room. To understand why my brother's words cut so deep, you'd have to go back 15 years. The day I graduated from the United States Air Force Academy, I stood at attention in crisp whites under the blazing Colorado sun. My family wasn't there. They thought I'd dropped out, abandoned my dream, failed. The truth was that only weeks later, I received my first assignment in military intelligence. From that day forward, silence became part of my life. I signed stacks of classified documents. I trained endlessly, learning how to live in two skins: Claire, the ordinary woman, and Claire, the officer whose missions would never make the news. Meanwhile, my family spun their own story. My mother, Margaret, whispered to relatives at every gathering, "Claire's still working service jobs. It's embarrassing. I keep hoping she'll outgrow it, but she's still just a waitress." Michael, on the other hand, carried himself like royalty. "While my sister's slinging coffee, I'm closing real estate deals. I'm the one who made it." He became the golden child, while I was cast as the failure. At my grandmother's funeral, I stood in a plain black dress by her casket when my Uncle Frank leaned in, loud enough for everyone in the pews. "That's Margaret's oldest, 41, and still serving coffee. Pitiful." Laughter rippled down the row. I bit my lip, said nothing, but inside, something cold and final snapped. A door closed in me that day, and I knew one day they would see who I really was. I lived in a cramped two-bedroom apartment in Arlington, drove the same Jeep Wrangler I'd had since college. To my family, it was proof I lacked ambition, that I'd wasted my potential. What they didn't know was that I was a commander in Air Force intelligence, coordinating joint operations with Navy SEALs, the CIA, and units across 3 continents. One summer, I was in Somalia, working with hostage rescue teams. Another year, I sat in a pitch-dark room directing drones across the Syrian border. And yet, whenever I came home, all I said was, "Government work, just paperwork." Hidden beneath my bed was a safe. Inside, folded in heavy cardstock, lay a letter from the Secretary of Defense, its seal pressed in deep red ink. It commended me for successfully coordinating the mission that saved 12 American lives. I never showed it to anyone, partly for security, mostly because I no longer believed my family would feel pride, only disbelief. So the 2 lives ran on, side by side. One life where I was Claire, the disappointment, the eternal waitress. The other where I was Commander Donovan, making decisions in the dark that held lives in the balance. And tonight, as Michael turned me into a punchline in front of hundreds of guests, I felt those 2 worlds colliding. The truth was done hiding. The ballroom glowed with golden light, the soft swing of jazz floating through the air, while champagne glasses clinked in practiced rhythm. From my table at the far edge of the room, I tried to steady my breathing, my smile fixed in place. Michael stepped up to the podium in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, radiating the smug confidence of a man who had never been told no. His bride, Stephanie, sat glowing at the head table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Michael began, sweeping his eyes across the sea of guests. "Marriage is an achievement, and speaking of achievements, I'm proud of what I've built in real estate." Applause rose instantly. I pressed my lips together, waiting, because I knew what was coming. His voice shifted, dipping into that cutting tone he reserved for me. "And then there's my sister, Claire. For 20 years, she's stayed loyal to just one role, waitress. We all love her, of course. But sometimes I wonder, if she had just a little more ambition, maybe she'd have done something with her life." Laughter flickered across the room, awkward, polite, but sharp enough to sting. My eyes lifted and found my father. Thomas shook his head slowly, disappointment etched into his face. It pierced deeper than Michael's words. Then my gaze shifted to Stephanie. She looked at me with uneasy eyes, her smile faltering. Even she seemed embarrassed by the cruelty. I didn't flinch. I set my glass down gently, lips curved into a calm smile, and then I turned my head toward the ballroom doors, where I knew Captain Alvarez stood watching. I slipped away from the table and pushed open the doors to the terrace. Cool air swept across my face, carrying the hum of Boston's city lights. Skyscrapers glittered against the night sky, reflections trembling like shards of broken mirrors on the Charles River. I pulled out my phone and typed a single message. "Need to talk. Meet me outside." Within minutes, Captain Daniel Alvarez appeared. Tall, broad-shouldered. His white dress uniform gleamed under the terrace lights. His eyes narrowed when he saw me, cheeks still flushed from the sting of humiliation. "Claire?" he said, his voice low, heavy with anger. "You're the one they called a waitress?" I nodded. 15 years, Captain. They've never known the truth." His hand gripped my shoulder firmly. "You don't deserve this. Tell me, what do you want me to do?" I drew a steady breath. "All I want is the truth. No embellishments, no grandstanding. When the moment comes, let them see me for who I really am." His eyes burned with a restrained fire. "When the time is right, I'll speak. Trust me." I walked back into the ballroom, the music swelling again as Michael entertained a circle of guests with stories of million-dollar deals. He laughed easily, oblivious to the storm forming in the room. I returned to my seat, lifting my glass once more, my face calm and unreadable, but my heart pounded with anticipation. Tonight, My two worlds would collide, and nothing would ever be the same again. The music faded, and the MC invited the groom to speak. Michael strode to the center of the ballroom, microphone in hand, the spotlight glinting off his black tuxedo. He lifted his chin as if the evening were his stage alone. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, voice brimming with confidence. "Marriage, career, success, none of it comes without effort and ambition, and I believe anyone can achieve greatness if they dare to dream big." Applause swelled across the room. I took a sip of champagne, steady and silent. My stomach tightened. I knew exactly what was coming. Michael turned, his eyes landing on me. But then, there are those who choose to stay in their comfort zone, like my sister. "Claire!" He paused just long enough for the crowd to shift toward me. 42 years old, and still loyal to just one job. Waitress. We love her, of course. But sometimes I wonder, if she had just a little more ambition, wouldn't her life look different? A ripple of whispers coursed through the room. Some guests lowered their eyes, unwilling to meet mine. Others forced uneasy smiles. From the head table, my mother laughed thinly, adding, "That's just how she is." Her words sliced sharper than Michael's. My hand clenched around the stem of my glass. Every part of me wanted to rise and speak, but I held my ground. Just a few more seconds. I inhaled slowly, eyes sliding to the corner of the room where Captain Alvarez sat upright, his gaze steady, waiting. Michael's voice grew louder, riding the attention he craved. "So let's raise a glass to my sister, our eternal waitress, who has spent her whole life serving—" He lifted his champagne high, expecting laughter. Instead, a single voice cut through the silence, sharp as a blade. "Stop talking." The ballroom froze. I turned toward the sound. Captain Daniel Alvarez rose to his full height, his white dress uniform gleaming under the lights. The air seemed to lock in place. He stepped forward, his voice carrying with unshakable authority. "The woman you just mocked as a waitress is Commander Claire Donovan, United States Air Force Intelligence." Every murmur died instantly. You could feel the weight of the words drop like stone. Then came the blow that silenced even the skeptics. Only 8 months ago, she commanded an operation that rescued 14 American hostages from Yemen. The mission was flawless. 0 casualties. The sharp crash of glass rang out. My mother's wine goblet had slipped from her hands, shattering across the hardwood floor. Her face drained of color, her hands trembling. Michael stood frozen, his complexion shifting from flushed red to a ghostly pale. Beside him, Stephanie's mouth fell open, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Captain Alvarez's tone never wavered. "When she walks into a military room, we stand at attention. She hasn't just served, she has served this country, saving lives most of you will never even know about." The room was so quiet it felt suffocating. My heart pounded in my chest, steady and certain. 15 years of silence had just been torn apart in a single moment, and nothing would ever go back to the way it was. The air in the ballroom thickened until it felt heavy enough to choke on. Every gaze locked onto me as I pushed back my chair and rose to my feet. My legs were steady, my voice calm, carrying across the silence like a bell. "I'm Claire Donovan," I said, each word deliberate. "And yes, I've worked for the government. In fact, I've served in Air Force intelligence for the past 15 years. A murmur rippled, then died. Faces I had known my whole life blinked at me as if seeing a stranger. You saw me live in a small apartment, drive an old Jeep, and decided that meant failure. The truth is, I live modestly because I'm gone for months at a time. I need a car that will start after sitting idle, a home I can walk away from when duty calls. You saw the sunburns on my skin and thought I was working at a beach cafe. In reality, I had just come back from Somalia, then Yemen. A sharp exhale sounded from the back of the room. I let it hang before continuing. When you called me a waitress, I said, locking eyes with Michael. I was commanding missions that saved American lives. When you mocked my lack of ambition, I was making choices that shaped national security. I turned toward my parents. Every time you introduced me as your shame, I was returning from operations no one outside the government will ever know. I stayed silent because of the oath I swore. But tonight, that silence ends. The ballroom fell utterly still. My Uncle Frank stared at his shoes. My cousin Janet's cheeks flushed crimson. And Michael, he stood frozen, hollow-eyed, his confidence stripped away, staring at me like the ground beneath him had just collapsed. Michael's lips moved, but his words tumbled out broken, stripped of the bravado he wore so easily minutes earlier. "Claire, I'm sorry. I didn't know." His voice was thin, almost pitiful, and no one leaned in to hear him. Around him, the wedding guests stood stiff, their polite smiles gone. Stephanie, his bride, remained at his side but didn't touch him. Her face had gone pale, her eyes hollow. When she looked at him, it was with the sharp, cold realization that she had tied herself to a man who thrived on belittling others, especially his own sister. I caught the faint tremor in her hands as she clutched her bouquet, and I knew whatever illusions she'd held about him had shattered. I turned away, unwilling to give him the comfort of my gaze. When the last toast ended and the band struck up another round of music, I slipped out of the ballroom. The hum of voices rose behind me, but it no longer had power over me. For the first time in years, I felt lighter. The sound of hurried footsteps followed me into the quiet corridor. My father's voice broke the silence. "Claire, wait!" I stopped. He caught up, his chest heaving, his eyes wet. This was the man who had once looked at me with disappointment carved deep into his face. Now his voice cracked, heavy with regret. "I'm sorry, Claire. I've been blind for too long. Tonight I've never been prouder." I held his gaze, steady, even as my chest tightened. My mother, Margaret, came next, her hand trembling as it closed around mine. "My daughter," she whispered, her voice brittle. I was wrong. I told myself lies because they were easier than not knowing. "I'm so sorry. Please forgive me." I let her words settle, then answered, calm and unshaken. "The truth doesn't need permission to exist, but thank you for finally seeing me." They both wept, and for a moment, we stood in silence, the three of us caught between past wounds and the fragile chance of repair. In the months that followed, the ripple of that night spread through the family. Word trickled down first in hushed phone calls, then in louder whispers at gatherings. Stephanie filed for divorce, the papers signed before their first anniversary. People in Michael's business circles whispered with disdain, "That's the man who mocked his sister, the Air Force commander." His reputation curdled, clients drifted away, and the shine of his empire dulled. For me, life took on a different light. My father began inviting me to lunches with his old firefighter friends. I heard him introduce me with a pride I never thought possible. "This is my daughter, Claire. She's an intelligence officer." The words carried a weight he seemed to savor. My mother threw herself into volunteer work with military family support groups. "It's the least I can do," she told me once, eyes soft with guilt. I missed the chance to honor my own daughter. I won't make that mistake again. I knew then that the balance had shifted. The shame that had once been mine was no longer resting on my shoulders. It had been returned to those who had cast it there. And I carried only the truth, finally, openly, without apology. On a crisp autumn morning, sunlight spilled through the windows of my Arlington apartment, glinting off the Charles River in ripples of gold. The air was cool, the kind that made every breath feel fresh, like starting over. On the small wooden table by the window, I had placed something that had once been hidden for years, the commendation letter from the Secretary of Defense. The red seal caught the light, bold and unashamed. For the first time, it wasn't locked in a safe. It was out in the open, exactly where it belonged. For 15 years, I had lived in two worlds, one where I was the family's failure, and another where I was a commander, respected in silence by those who truly knew what I did. Now those worlds had merged. There was no more pretending, no more quiet endurance. There was only one truth left. I am who I have always been. I sipped my coffee, the warmth spreading through me, and smiled. An unforced smile I hadn't worn in years. Not because I needed my family's recognition, not because the whispers had finally gone quiet, but because I no longer had to hide myself. The truth had freed me from my family's judgment, from the weight of their disappointment, and most of all, from the fear that had kept me silent. For the first time, I was whole. One world, one self.